Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing. Let's begin.
Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 1 in Glass Walls and Draft Lines. The morning light reflected across the glass building of Nexera Systems, turning it into a mirror of the city. People moved with quiet purpose as badges scanned, elevators opened, conversation stayed low and focused. Everything followed a pattern. Adrian Vale stood at the entrance for a moment, observing. Not hesitating, just understanding. He watched how people moved, how systems operated, how structure held everything together. Then he stepped inside. The office felt precise. Open workspaces aligned in clean sections, glass meeting rooms labeled with project names, and large screens showing system dashboards. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled. First day, the receptionist asked. Adrian nodded. Back-end systems. She handed him a badge. 6th floor. Thanks. The elevator ride was quiet. Adrian stood still, watching the numbers rise. By the time the doors opened, his focus had already shifted. Adrian? He turned to see Rahul. Tech lead, he said. Good to meet you, Adrian replied. Rahul gestured toward a workstation. We skip long introductions here. You learn by doing. That suited him. They stopped at a system dashboard. Core product, Rahul said. Handles heavy traffic. Needs to stay stable. Adrian studied it carefully. Not looking for errors, understanding flow. There's a scaling issue, Rahul added. Not breaking yet. But it will. Adrian nodded once. I'll find it. Across the city, our Clinia studio carried a different energy. Open space, sketches, and design boards filled the room. It wasn't structured like Nexera, but it was intentional. Elena Cross stood near a drafting table, reviewing plans. Lines overlapped, spaces connected, and every detail had purpose. Client review tomorrow, a colleague said. They want something more integrated. Elena paused. Integrated how? Smart systems. Automation. She adjusted a line slightly. Then it's not just design, she said. It's interaction. Her colleague nodded. Elena leaned back, seeing the plan differently now, not just structure, but behavior. By evening, Adrian was deep into system logs. The issue wasn't obvious, but it existed under pressure. This isn't a bug, he said quietly. It was structural. At the same time, Elena revised her design, not changing how it looked, but how it would function. Two different problems. Two different worlds. But both moving toward the same idea. A system. Not yet connected. But already aligned. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 2 Patterns Under Pressure. By the second morning, Nexera Systems no longer felt unfamiliar to Adrian Vale. The movement, the structure, the workflow, everything had already reduced itself into patterns. What others saw as a busy office, he saw as a system stabilizing in cycles. He reached his desk, logged in, and reopened the system logs from the previous day. The scaling issue was still there. Subtle, hidden under normal conditions, but visible when pressure increased. Rahul walked over with a coffee. Settling in? Adrian replied, there's a bottleneck under peak load. Rahul raised an eyebrow. Already? It builds slowly, Adrian said. Not immediate. But consistent. Rahul leaned slightly forward. Cause? Adrian paused briefly. Data flow isn't distributed properly. It stacks. Rahul smiled faintly. Good. Fix it, but understand it first. Adrian nodded. That was already the plan. He didn't rush to change anything. Instead, he traced the system flow again, step by step, mapping how requests moved, where delays formed, and how small inefficiencies combined under pressure. This isn't a quick fix, he said quietly. It needed redesign. Across the city, our Clinia studio moved with a different kind of energy. Elena Cross stood in front of a large display, her design projected clearly. "Walk us through it," a senior partner said. Elena stepped forward. "The structure adapts to usage. Lighting, airflow, and space respond to how people move." A client leaned forward. "So, automation?" "Integration," she corrected calmly. He nodded slowly. "Can it be implemented?" Elena paused for a moment before answering. "Only if the system behind it is designed correctly." Back at Nexera, Adrian leaned back slightly, studying a flow diagram he had drawn. The issue wasn't isolated. It connected across multiple layers. Fixing it meant changing how the system behaved under pressure, not just correcting outputs. He opened a new workspace and began restructuring a section carefully. Small changes. Controlled adjustments. Around him, the office continued its rhythm. But Adrian had already tuned it out. At Arclinia, the meeting ended without final approval. Elena stood near the window, thinking. "Client wants more clarity," her colleague said. "Not just design." Elena nodded. "Then we don't present it as design." He looked at her. "Then what?" She replied, "A system. 2 different environments. 2 different problems. But both moving toward the same requirement. Something that doesn't fail under pressure. Something that works beyond theory." They didn't know it yet. But their work was already starting to point toward the same place. And soon, those paths would meet. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 3, Pressure Points. By the 3rd day, Adrian Vale had already moved past the idea of being new. The system at Nexera Systems was no longer unfamiliar. It had revealed its structure, its rhythm, and more importantly, its weak points. And weak points were where real work began. The morning stand-up was quick. Each developer gave short updates, progress, blockers, next steps. No unnecessary words. When it was Adrian's turn, he said, "Scaling issue identified. Working on restructuring flow." Rahul looked at him. "Timeline? 2 days for stable output." Rahul nodded. "Understand it fully before pushing changes." Adrian gave a slight nod. That was already clear. After the meeting, the office returned to its steady rhythm. Screens filled with code, conversations remained low, and work moved forward without noise. But Adrian's focus narrowed completely. The issue wasn't simple. Under normal traffic, the system behaved correctly. But as load increased, delays began stacking. Not instantly, but gradually. Small inefficiencies turning into visible slowdowns. He leaned back slightly, analyzing the flow. "This isn't a bug," he said quietly. It was a design limitation. Which meant solving it required more than fixing, it required rethinking. He opened a new model and started mapping the system again, layer by layer. Across the city, our Clinia studio carried a different kind of pressure. Elena Cross stood in front of her updated design. The structure looked refined, but the discussion wasn't about appearance anymore. "Client wants implementation clarity," her senior said. "Not just concept." Elena didn't respond immediately. She studied the design for a moment. "Then we stopped presenting it as concept," she said. Her senior looked at her. "Meaning?" "We present it as a working system." A short pause followed. "That requires technical integration," he said. Elena nodded. "Then we bring it in." Back at Nexera, Adrian adjusted the system model carefully. Every change was controlled. Every modification tested. He ran a simulation. The result improved. Not perfect, but closer. Rahul walked by and glanced at the screen. "You're not fixing it," he said. Adrian replied, "Fixes don't scale." Rahul gave a faint smile. "Good." At Arclinia, Elena revised her design again, not visually, but structurally. She created space for integration, leaving room for systems to function without conflict. She stepped back and looked at the board. Now it felt different. Not complete, but ready. By evening, both of them were still working. Different places. Different problems. But both focused on the same challenge. How to make something hold under pressure. They didn't know it yet. But their solutions were moving toward each other. And soon, those separate lines would begin to meet. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 4, First Intersection. By the fourth day, the direction of the work began to change. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale noticed it in the files before anything else. New documents appeared in the shared workspace: external inputs, architectural layouts, integration notes. This was no longer just internal system work. Rahul placed a file on his desk. Cross-company project, he said. Smart infrastructure. Adrian looked at the overview. We handle systems? Rahul nodded. They handle design. You'll meet them today. Adrian closed the file slightly. Constraints? Rahul replied, you'll hear them directly. At Arclinia Studio, Elena reviewed the same project from the design side. The structure on screen wasn't just a building, it required coordination with something beyond architecture. Client wants full integration, her senior said. Smart systems included. Elena studied the layout. Then design depends on system behavior. Her senior nodded. Which means alignment. Elena didn't respond, but she understood the importance. The meeting was scheduled in the afternoon. Both teams, same room. Adrian entered early and took his place. The room was familiar, but the situation was not. This was no longer about isolated work. It required coordination. The door opened. Elena walked in with her team. Calm. Focused. Observant. Introductions were brief. The meeting started immediately. Elena presented first. The design appeared on screen as structured, clean, intentional. This space adapts based on usage, she said. Environmental systems respond to occupancy. Adrian listened carefully. Not just to the design, but to how it would function. When it was his turn, he spoke clearly. Real-time response requires stable data flow, he said. Any delay affects performance. Elena looked at him. Then delay becomes critical. It does, Adrian replied. A short pause followed. Rahul said, we need alignment between system and structure. Elena nodded. Then both must be designed together. Adrian added, not separately. The discussion continued, focused, technical, precise. Constraints were identified. Adjustments considered. No conflict, just clarity. As the meeting ended, both teams gathered their notes. Adrian closed his laptop. Elena closed her file. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Not intentional. But noticed. Outside, everything continued as usual. Inside, something had shifted. Two separate paths. Now connected by one shared problem. The first intersection had happened. Quietly. But it mattered. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 5, Structured Friction. The next meeting didn't carry introductions. It carried expectations. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale entered the room with a clearer understanding of the project. This was no longer about identifying problems. It was about aligning two systems that were designed differently. Elena was already there, reviewing the model on screen. The meeting began without delay. This section requires real-time adjustment, Elena said, pointing at the central transition zone. Lighting and airflow must respond instantly. Adrian looked at the diagram. Instant response requires localized processing. Elena replied, then avoid delay. Central validation ensures stability, Adrian said. A short pause followed. Not tension, but difference. Elena stepped slightly closer to the screen. If response lags, the experience breaks. Adrian met her point calmly. If validation is removed, the system becomes unstable. Both statements held. Neither was wrong. Rahul crossed his arms. Then find a balance. That was all he said. Adrian turned his laptop toward the table and adjusted the system flow. Localized triggers handle immediate response, he explained. Central system validates asynchronously. Elena studied the change carefully. Response remains fast, she said. And consistency remains intact, Adrian added. A brief pause. Then Elena nodded. That works. The discussion moved forward quickly after that. No repeated arguments. No unnecessary explanations. Once alignment was found, both moved on. Later, as the meeting ended, most of the team left. Adrian stayed for a moment, reviewing the updated structure. Elena remained near the table. You don't compromise easily, she said. Adrian replied, only when it improves the system. She gave a slight nod. Fair. They walked out at the same time. Not planned. Just timing. Outside, the city carried its usual movement. For a few steps, neither spoke. Then Elena said, you focus on control. Adrian replied, I focus on stability. She looked ahead. I focus on experience. He nodded slightly. Both are required. They continued walking for a short distance before their paths separated. No pause. No extra words. Just. Tomorrow. Yeah. At Nexera, Adrian returned to his desk and reviewed the updated system. It held better now. Not perfect. But improved. At Arclinia, Elena adjusted her design slightly. Not visibly. But functionally. Two approaches. Different priorities. Now aligned under one solution. The friction hadn't slowed them down. It had refined them. And that made the system stronger.
Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 6, Refinement. The next phase didn't begin with urgency. It began with clarity. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale reviewed the updated system after the last meeting. The changes were holding. Response times were stable, and validation delays no longer created visible issues under load. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. And when something worked, the approach changed. Rahul stood beside him for a moment. Better, he said. Adrian nodded. Still needs refinement. Rahul replied, then refine it. Don't rebuild it. That was the difference now. Across the city, Elena Cross worked the same way. She didn't redesign the structure. Instead, she focused on behavior. Small adjustments in layout, slight shifts in direction, subtle cues that influenced movement. Her colleague looked at the plan. Nothing major changed. Elena said, it doesn't need to. It just needs to work better. Later that day, both teams met again. No long discussion. Just progress. Adrian presented the updated system. Localized response is stable. Validation doesn't delay execution anymore. Elena reviewed it. Movement flow aligns better. No forced interaction. Rahul nodded. Then focus on edge cases. They tested different scenarios. High density. Low activity. Unexpected pauses. Elena pointed at a section. There's still a delay here. Adrian looked closely. Prediction assumes continuous movement. She replied, people don't move like that. A short pause. Then Adrian said, then prediction changes. Elena added, and space guides movement. He nodded. That balances it. The solution came quickly. Not because it was simple. Because they understood each other. As the meeting ended, there was no need for extended discussion. Everything was clear. Outside, they walked out together again. No planning. Just timing. Elena said, "You rely on logic." Adrian replied, "It's consistent." She looked ahead. "I rely on instinct." He asked, "Is it reliable?" She smiled slightly. "Not always. But sometimes it sees what logic misses." A brief pause followed. Adrian didn't argue. They reached the usual point where their paths separated. No hesitation. Just. Tomorrow. Yeah. Back at Nexera, Adrian reviewed the system again. It didn't just hold, it adapted. At Arclinia, Elena stepped back from her design. It didn't just look right. It felt right. Two different approaches. Now working together. With less friction. More clarity. And steady progress. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 7, Quiet Alignment. By the end of the week, the work no longer felt like two separate teams trying to connect ideas. It felt like one system slowly forming, where each part understood the other without needing constant explanation. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale noticed the shift clearly. Earlier, he had to break down every problem from the beginning, analyzing each layer independently. Now, he could anticipate how the design would behave before even testing it. That reduced effort, but more importantly, it reduced uncertainty. He reviewed a new simulation output on his screen. The system was stable overall, but there was a small inconsistency in how it handled unpredictable movement patterns. It wasn't an error yet, but it had the potential to become one under real conditions. Adrian leaned back slightly, observing the flow instead of reacting immediately. The system assumed smooth, continuous movement, but real behavior rarely followed that pattern. At the same time, across the city, Elena Cross stood in front of her design, studying the same section from a different perspective. She didn't look at data, she looked at movement. The space she had created naturally encouraged people to slow down, to pause, even if only for a moment. That pause was subtle, but it changed everything. Later that day, they met again. The discussion didn't need long explanations. Adrian pointed at the section and said that the system assumed continuous movement. Elena responded that people didn't behave that way in that space. There was a brief pause, not because of disagreement, but because both had already reached the same conclusion. Adrian said that the system needed to adapt. Elena added that the space should support that adaptation. Neither of them needed to explain further. The solution formed naturally between them. After the meeting, they walked out together again. This time, it didn't feel accidental. It felt like a continuation of the same flow they had built during work. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was comfortable. After a few moments, Elena said that things were getting easier. Adrian replied that it was because they were no longer starting from the beginning each time. She nodded, adding that they already understood how each other thought. Adrian didn't disagree. As they reached the point where their paths separated, there was a small pause. Not long, but enough to be noticed. Then, as usual, they acknowledged the next day without needing to say more. They walked away in different directions, but the distance between them didn't feel the same anymore. The alignment they had built in their work was slowly extending beyond it, shaping something that neither of them needed to define yet. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 8, Extended Hours. By the start of the next week, the project had moved beyond normal working hours. It was no longer something that stayed within meetings or office schedules. It followed both of them into the quiet parts of the day, where focus became deeper and distractions disappeared. At Nexera Systems, most of the floor had emptied by evening, but Adrian Vale remained at his desk. The system was stable, yet something about it felt incomplete. Not broken, but not fully resolved either. He watched the simulation closely, noticing how small variations in behavior created slight inconsistencies in response timing. They were minor, almost unnoticeable, but Adrian knew those details mattered. Instead of rushing into changes, he observed. The system wasn't failing, it was reacting differently under real conditions. That meant the issue wasn't in the code alone. It was in how behavior was being interpreted. Across the city, Arclinia's studio had also grown quiet. Elena stood near her workspace, reviewing the same transition area. Her design encouraged natural pauses, but the system still expected movement. That mismatch was small, but it was enough to affect overall performance. She traced the layout slowly, thinking through how people would move through the space. The pause wasn't a problem. It was natural. The system just needed to understand it. Later that night, a message appeared in the shared workspace. Adrian noted the inconsistency in transition response. Elena replied shortly after, confirming that the space itself caused that behavior. The conversation stayed brief, but precise. There was no need for long explanations. Adrian adjusted the prediction logic to account for pauses instead of continuous flow. Elena refined the spatial cues to guide movement more naturally without forcing it. Their changes happened in parallel, but aligned. When Adrian ran the simulation again, the system stabilized. The delay disappeared. Not because the issue was removed, but because it was understood. He paused for a moment before typing a simple confirmation. Elena responded with the same clarity. That night ended without any formal conclusion, but something had changed. The work no longer depended on meetings or structured discussions. It moved naturally between them, even in silence. When Adrian reached home, he didn't reopen his laptop. For once, the system didn't need immediate attention. At the same time, Elena closed her sketchbook earlier than usual. The design felt complete for the moment. 2 different places. 2 different routines. But one shared understanding. They were no longer just working on the same project. They were working together, even when they weren't in the same room. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 9, Small Adjustments. The next phase of the project did not begin with a major breakthrough, but with small, careful refinements. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale reviewed the latest system output, noting that stability had improved significantly. The system no longer struggled under pressure, but there were still minor inefficiencies hidden beneath the surface. They weren't obvious at first glance, but Adrian noticed them in the patterns, slight delays that appeared under specific conditions. He leaned back slightly, studying the flow. Better, he said quietly, but not complete. Across the city, Elena stood in front of the updated design at Arclinia's studio. The structure looked refined, and movement through the space had improved, but something still felt slightly off. It wasn't a flaw, just a subtle resistance in how people would move through one transition area. She traced the layout with her eyes, visualizing real movement instead of theoretical flow. Still guiding too much, she murmured. The design worked, but it wasn't fully natural yet. Later that day, they met again for a short review. There was no need for long explanations anymore. Adrian pointed to the system model and said, "Response improved, but there's still a delay here." Elena looked at the same section and replied, "Movement doesn't align perfectly." A brief pause followed before Adrian added, "The system still assumes ideal behavior." Elena nodded slightly and said, "And the design still tries to control it." They both understood the issue immediately. Rahul glanced between them and said simply, "Then adjust both." Adrian refined the system logic, allowing it to respond more flexibly instead of expecting perfect input. Elena adjusted the design in subtle ways, reducing control and allowing movement to feel more natural. Neither change was dramatic, but together they improved the system in a way that neither could achieve alone. After the meeting, they remained for a moment longer. Adrian reviewed the updated output, watching the delay reduce further. Elena observed the design, seeing how the changes affected flow. There was no need for discussion. The results spoke clearly. "You focus on precision," Elena said quietly. Adrian looked at the screen and replied, "You focus on experience." She gave a slight nod. "Both matter." He agreed. "They do." As they left the room, the project felt different again, not because of a major shift, but because of how naturally they had refined it together. Outside, the evening moved at its usual pace, but for them, the work had reached a point where effort felt lighter. Small adjustments had made the system stronger. And without realizing it, they were beginning to understand not just the project, but each other. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 10, Natural Shift. The following week began without urgency, but something had changed. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale noticed it in the way the system behaved. The constant need to fix issues had reduced. Now, the system held steady under most conditions. It didn't require attention every moment, and that gave him space to observe instead of react. He reviewed the predictive model again. It worked, but not perfectly. The system still relied too much on past data. When behavior shifted suddenly, the response lagged slightly. Still reacting, not adapting, he said quietly. Across the city, Elena stood in front of the design board, studying movement patterns. The structure worked well, but real usage continued to introduce variation. People didn't always follow the intended flow. She traced the layout with her eyes. They don't repeat behavior exactly, she said softly. The design allowed flexibility, but not enough. Later that day, they met again. Short discussion. Clear focus. Adrian pointed at the system output. Prediction depends on history, but behavior changes too fast. Elena looked at the same section. Because space changes how people move. A brief pause followed. Then Adrian said, then prediction needs to update continuously. Elena nodded. And design should not restrict movement. Rahul looked at both of them. Then build it that way. Adrian adjusted the system logic, allowing real-time updates instead of fixed prediction cycles. Elena refined the layout, reducing control and allowing more natural flow. The changes were small, but effective. Adrian ran the system again. Stable. Faster response. Better alignment. This works, he said. Elena reviewed the movement simulation. It feels natural now. No further explanation needed. As they packed up, Elena asked, "Do you always think ahead like this?" Adrian replied, "It prevents problems later." She smiled slightly. "I think in the moment more." He nodded. "That works too." They walked out together. No plan. No discussion. Just timing. Outside, the city moved as usual. But their pace was slower. After a few steps, Elena said, "This doesn't feel like just work anymore." Adrian looked ahead and replied, "It isn't." They reached the usual point where their paths separated. A short pause. "Tomorrow," she said. "Yeah," he replied. They walked away. But something had shifted. Not in the system. Not in the design. But between them. And it was no longer subtle. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 11, Shared Rhythm. By the 6th week, the project no longer felt intense. It felt steady. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale reviewed the latest system logs, and for the first time there were no alerts, no unusual spikes, and no urgent fixes waiting. The structure they had built was holding firm under pressure, and instead of searching for faults, he found himself observing how smoothly everything worked. It was a different kind of focus, one that didn't come from urgency but from understanding. Rahul walked over, glanced at the screen, and asked if everything was stable. Adrian replied that it was consistent under load and no immediate risks were visible. Rahul gave a small nod and said that this was where systems should be, able to run without constant correction. Adrian understood that clearly. Not everything needed to be pushed further. Some things needed to be trusted. Across the city, Elena stood in front of her design board at Arclinia Studio, studying a layout that no longer demanded changes. The design had moved beyond correction and into something complete. It now reflected movement, interaction, and flow without needing adjustment. A colleague asked if she was finished revising, and Elena replied calmly that there was nothing left to change. He nodded and said that meant it was ready, and she quietly agreed. Later that afternoon, Adrian and Elena met for a short review session. The discussion was brief and efficient. Adrian confirmed that system predictions were stable, while Elena confirmed that movement aligned naturally with the design. Rahul listened, nodded once, and closed the meeting without extending it. There was nothing more to fix. As the meeting ended, Adrian closed his laptop but didn't stand immediately. Elena noticed and said that he wasn't rushing today. Adrian replied that there was nothing urgent left to handle. She nodded and said that felt different, and he agreed. They walked out together without planning it. It had become natural. Outside, the evening felt calmer, and neither of them rushed. After a few steps, Elena said that work didn't feel the same anymore. Adrian replied that stability changed things, but she added that it wasn't only about the work. He understood and nodded. The silence between them felt comfortable. It no longer needed to be filled. They reached the cafe and sat down as if it was already part of their routine. Elena said it was becoming familiar, and Adrian replied that familiarity wasn't a bad thing. She smiled slightly, and for a moment, nothing more needed to be said. Later, as they walked to the usual point where their paths separated, they paused briefly. Elena asked about tomorrow, and Adrian said yes. That was enough. They went their separate ways, but something had shifted. It wasn't sudden, but it was steady. They had found a rhythm, and it stayed with them. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 12, Beyond the Structure. The next few days didn't bring urgency, but they brought awareness. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale noticed a shift in how he approached work. The system was stable, but instead of searching for problems, he began observing how it behaved over time. Small variations appeared in usage, slight changes in load, and patterns that weren't part of the original design. It wasn't failure. It was adaptation. He watched the system run without interference. Rahul asked if everything was holding. Adrian replied that it was, but behavior was evolving. Rahul nodded and said that was expected. Systems didn't stay fixed once they met real use. This time, Adrian didn't rush to correct it. Across the city, Elena Cross noticed something similar. At Arclinia Studio, she reviewed updated behavior models. The space was being used differently than expected. People paused where they weren't meant to, interacted where they didn't have to, and moved naturally. It didn't break the design. It improved it. A colleague asked if she would adjust the layout. Elena said no. The design worked because it allowed variation. Changing it would remove that. Later, Adrian and Elena met again. There was no issue to solve. Adrian explained how the system adapted. Elena explained how space encouraged behavior. They weren't fixing anything. They were understanding it. As they stepped outside, the evening felt calm. Elena said things were changing without effort. Adrian replied that systems evolve once stable. She nodded. Design does the same. They walked without direction. The silence felt natural. At the usual point, they paused. Elena asked about tomorrow. Adrian said yes. That was enough. Something had changed. Quietly. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 13, Unplanned Space. The project had reached a stage where nothing required immediate correction, but something new had started to appear. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale noticed it in the data first. User behavior was shifting. Not dramatically, not in a way that broke the system, but enough to change how it was being used. Certain areas showed longer interaction times. People weren't just passing through. They were staying. He studied the patterns carefully. The system had been designed for flow, but now it was supporting interaction. It wasn't wrong. It was unexpected. Across the city, Elena Cross observed the same change in a different form. The central space in her design, originally meant as a transition area, had become a place people naturally gathered. There were no added elements forcing it. The space simply allowed it. She didn't see it as a mistake. She saw it as behavior. A colleague asked if she would adjust the design to correct it. Elena replied calmly that there was nothing to correct. The space was doing something more than planned. Changing it would reduce its value. Later that day, Adrian and Elena reviewed the same observation together. Adrian explained how the increased interaction affected system load. Elena explained how the design allowed it to happen naturally. Neither tried to remove the change. Instead, they adapted around it. Adrian adjusted how the system handled higher density in that zone. Elena refined the design subtly, guiding movement without interrupting it. The goal wasn't control. It was balance. As they stepped outside, the city felt quieter than usual. Elena said the space had changed on its own. Adrian replied that systems follow behavior once they stabilize. She nodded and said design should do the same. They walked slowly, without deciding a direction. The silence between them didn't feel empty anymore. It felt understood. After a few moments, Elena said she used to design based on intention. Now she was starting to design based on reality. Adrian replied that he used to focus only on logic, but now he considered how things were experienced. They stopped near a quiet corner, not planned. Just where their steps slowed. No one spoke for a moment. They didn't need to. At the usual point where their paths separated, Elena asked about tomorrow. Adrian said yes. That was enough. The project was evolving. So were they. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 14, Controlled Imbalance. Stability had brought clarity, but it also revealed imbalance. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale noticed uneven load distribution in one section of the system. It wasn't failing, but it wasn't efficient either. One part was handling more than expected, while others remained underused. He studied the structure carefully. The system was compensating, but not optimally. Across the city, Elena Cross saw the same imbalance in design. The central space had taken on more purpose than originally planned. It was no longer just a transition zone. It had become a focal point. Too much is happening here, she said quietly. Not wrong. But not balanced. Later, they met to review the issue. Adrian explained how the system load concentrated in that area. Elena explained how the design naturally drew people toward it. Neither tried to fix it independently. Adrian suggested redistributing system load dynamically. Elena suggested guiding movement through subtle design changes, not forcing but influencing. They adjusted both sides. Adrian implemented adaptive load balancing. Elena introduced small spatial cues that encouraged distribution. The change was not obvious, but it was effective. The imbalance didn't disappear completely. But it became controlled. After the meeting, they walked out together again. This time, Adrian paused briefly and suggested a different place nearby. Elena agreed without hesitation. The space was quieter, less crowded. They sat without speaking immediately. The silence felt comfortable, not unfamiliar. Elena said she usually avoided changing core design once it was set. Adrian replied that adaptation wasn't breaking something, it was improving it. She thought about that and nodded. The conversation remained simple, but carried more meaning than before. As they walked back, the city lights reflected softly across the street. When they reached the point where they usually separated, the pause lasted a little longer. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because the moment didn't feel rushed. Something had shifted again. Not dramatically, but clearly. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 14, Controlled Imbalance. Stability had brought clarity, but it also revealed imbalance. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale noticed uneven load distribution in one section of the system. It wasn't failing, but it wasn't efficient either. One part was handling more than expected, while others remained underused. He studied the structure carefully. The system was compensating, but not optimally. Across the city, Elena Cross saw the same imbalance in design. The central space had taken on more purpose than originally planned. It was no longer just a transition zone. It had become a focal point. Too much is happening here, she said quietly. Not wrong. But not balanced. Later, they met to review the issue. Adrian explained how the system load concentrated in that area. Elena explained how the design naturally drew people toward it. Neither tried to fix it independently. Adrian suggested redistributing system load dynamically. Elena suggested guiding movement through subtle design changes, not forcing but influencing. They adjusted both sides. Adrian implemented adaptive load balancing. Elena introduced small spatial cues that encouraged distribution. The change was not obvious, but it was effective. The imbalance didn't disappear completely. But it became controlled. After the meeting, they walked out together again. This time, Adrian paused briefly and suggested a different place nearby. Elena agreed without hesitation. The space was quieter, less crowded. They sat without speaking immediately. The silence felt comfortable, not unfamiliar. Elena said she usually avoided changing core design once it was set. Adrian replied that adaptation wasn't breaking something, it was improving it. She thought about that and nodded. The conversation remained simple, but carried more meaning than before. As they walked back, the city lights reflected softly across the street. When they reached the point where they usually separated, the pause lasted a little longer. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because the moment didn't feel rushed. Something had shifted again. Not dramatically, but clearly. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 16, After the Pause. The next morning didn't feel like a continuation of work. It felt like something had shifted quietly. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale returned to his desk, but his focus wasn't as rigid as before. The system was stable, and for once, he didn't immediately begin analyzing it. He opened the dashboard, checked the metrics, and confirmed everything was running smoothly. Then he stopped. There was nothing demanding attention. Instead of searching for problems, he allowed the system to run without interference. Rahul noticed and asked if everything was fine. Adrian replied that it was. Rahul gave a small nod and said that stability meant the system could be trusted. Adrian understood that differently now. Trust wasn't just about systems. It extended beyond them. Across the city, Elena stood in front of her design board but didn't pick up her pencil immediately. She looked at the layout, not searching for changes, but observing it as something complete. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to refine it further. Her thoughts moved elsewhere. To the previous evening, not as distraction, but as something that stayed. Later that day, they met again for a short review. The discussion was brief. Adrian confirmed system stability. Elena confirmed design alignment. Rahul closed the meeting quickly. There was nothing more to solve. As they stepped outside together, the transition from work to evening felt natural. There was no need to decide to walk together. It simply happened. After a few moments, Elena said that things felt different now. Adrian replied that they were. She asked if he noticed it too. He said yes. They walked without rushing. The silence between them felt steady, not empty. Elena said she was not used to leaving things without control. Adrian replied that not everything needed to be controlled to work. She nodded slowly. They reached the usual point where their paths separated, but neither moved immediately. The pause lasted longer than before. Not uncertain. Just real. Elena asked about tomorrow. Adrian said yes. They went their separate ways, but something remained. At home, Adrian didn't open his laptop immediately. At her apartment, Elena didn't start sketching. Two routines continued, but now, both carried something more. Not defined, but present. And growing. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 17, Unspoken Continuity. The days that followed did not bring major changes, but something continued to deepen. It wasn't visible in project updates or system reports. It existed in small moments, in pauses that no longer felt empty, and in the way Adrian and Elena moved through their routines with a quiet awareness of each other. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale returned to his structured workflow, but it no longer felt isolated. He still reviewed system behavior with precision, still traced patterns and responses, but there was less urgency in how he approached it. Stability had changed his perspective. Instead of searching only for failure points, he began understanding why things worked. Rahul reviewed the system briefly and said that it had reached a reliable state. Adrian agreed, but he also noticed something else. The system wasn't just stable. It was responsive in a way that felt natural. It adapted without needing constant correction. Across the city, Elena experienced a similar shift. At Arclinia Studio, her design no longer required active revision. Instead, she observed how small elements influenced behavior. Light, spacing, direction, details that shaped how people moved through the space without forcing them. A colleague asked if she was done with the project. Elena replied that she wasn't changing it anymore, but she was still learning from it. Later, Adrian and Elena met again. The discussion was short, focused, and effortless. They no longer needed to explain everything. Their understanding had aligned to a point where communication felt natural. As they stepped outside, Elena said that work didn't feel separate anymore. Adrian replied that it had become continuous. She nodded, understanding what he meant. They walked together, their pace naturally matching. After a while, Elena said she felt like things were progressing without being planned. Adrian replied that some things didn't need planning to work. The silence between them carried meaning. At the usual point, they paused. Elena said it was becoming a routine. Adrian replied that it wasn't a bad one. They both knew. It wasn't just routine anymore. Something was continuing, without being said. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 18, A Different Kind of Signal. The project had reached a stage where nothing urgent remained, but something new had started to emerge. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale noticed subtle shifts in user behavior. The system was working as expected, but people were interacting with it differently over time. Not enough to break anything, but enough to show change. He observed the patterns carefully. The system was adapting, but so were the users. It wasn't a one-sided process anymore. It had become a cycle. Rahul asked if there was an issue. Adrian replied that there wasn't. It was something else. A change that didn't need fixing, only understanding. Across the city, Elena noticed the same effect in her design. Spaces were being used in ways that went beyond their original purpose. People stayed longer, interacted more, and created patterns that were not planned but felt natural. She didn't try to correct it. She accepted it. Later, when they met, Adrian explained how the system responded to evolving behavior. Elena explained how the design allowed that behavior to form. They weren't solving a problem. They were recognizing a pattern. As they walked outside, the evening felt calm. Elena said that things were no longer predictable. Adrian replied that predictability wasn't always the goal. Sometimes systems worked better when they adapted. They walked slowly, without direction. After a moment, Adrian said that this didn't feel temporary anymore. Elena looked at him and said that it wasn't. There was no hesitation. No need for explanation. The understanding was already there. At the usual point, they paused. The silence felt different this time, not just calm, but certain. Elena said tomorrow. Adrian said yes. They walked away in different directions, but the distance didn't feel the same. Something had changed again. Not loudly, but clearly. And this time, it stayed. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 19, Defined Without Saying. The following days carried a quiet clarity. Nothing had been declared, nothing formally changed, and yet something between Adrian and Elena had become more defined. It didn't come from words or decisions. It came from consistency, from presence, and from the way both of them now moved through their routines with an understanding that didn't need to be explained. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale continued his work, but it no longer felt isolated. He still reviewed system behavior carefully, still followed patterns with precision, but he wasn't approaching everything as something that needed control. The system had reached a state where it could adapt, and he had started to trust it. Rahul looked at the system overview and said it was holding well. Adrian agreed, but added that it was adapting better than expected. Rahul nodded and said that was the goal. Systems should not resist change. They should work with it. Across the city, Elena stood in front of her design, observing how it behaved rather than trying to improve it. The structure no longer felt like something that needed refinement. It felt complete in a way that allowed it to evolve naturally. People used the space in their own way, and that made it stronger. Later, during a short review, Adrian and Elena confirmed alignment. There was no long discussion. No need to explain details. Their understanding had reached a point where words were minimal but effective. As they stepped outside together, Elena said they no longer planned these walks. Adrian replied that they didn't need to. She said that meant something, and he agreed. They walked in silence for a while, but it didn't feel empty. It felt steady. After a few steps, Adrian said that what they had didn't feel temporary. Elena slowed slightly and asked if he was sure. He said yes. She nodded. That was enough. No dramatic moment. No explanation. Just clarity. At the usual point, they paused. Elena said tomorrow. Adrian said yes. They went their separate ways, but something had already been defined. Without saying it. Blue Book Parallel Lines. Headphone Welcome to Meet Patel Audiobooks. Chapter 20, The Line That Shifted. The 20th day did not feel like an ending. It felt like a realization. The project had reached a point where it no longer needed constant attention. At Nexera Systems, Adrian Vale reviewed the system one more time, not searching for problems, but understanding what had been built. It was stable, adaptive, and capable of handling change without breaking. Rahul looked at the system and said it had reached a strong state. Adrian replied that it wasn't perfect, but it didn't need constant correction anymore. Rahul nodded and said that was when a system was truly ready. Across the city, Elena Cross stood in front of her design, seeing it not as a project, but as something that already existed in concept. It didn't need more changes. It needed to move forward. A colleague asked if she was finished. Elena replied that it was ready. Later, during the final review, both teams confirmed completion of this phase. There was no celebration, no long discussion, just acknowledgement. The work spoke for itself. As Adrian and Elena stepped outside, the moment felt different. Not because something had ended, but because something had completed. They walked together, their pace steady. Elena said this started as a project. Adrian replied that it was more than that now. She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. They reached the cafe but didn't go inside. Instead, they stayed outside, continuing their conversation without needing a place to hold it. After a while, Elena asked if this changed things. Adrian replied that it already had. There was no hesitation. Only understanding. As they reached the usual point, the pause felt different again. Not routine, not uncertain, just clear. Elena said tomorrow. Adrian said yes. They went their separate ways, but it didn't feel like distance anymore. The lines that once moved parallel had shifted. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But enough to change everything. And once a line shifts, it never returns to where it was before.